Greetings in the Tech Cave, Fenris here, and today I have in front of me another Super Nintendo. Now, you might be getting really tired of seeing me work on these, and to that I am sorry. I've just had a few Super Nintendos and Super Famicoms come my way, and I've been really eager to take a look at them, but I promise this is the last one of the year. So, with that out of the way, this system in particular was sent in to me by a good friend of mine, and unfortunately they were having some issues with the video output. So let's pop in our burn-in test cart and see what's going on. So I am set to RGB SCART, so far this is looking pretty fine. All right, work RAM is passing. Passing. APU, pass. All right, so everything looks pretty solid. So what could be the issue? Well, the issue isn't so much the video performance per se, but rather which video output is problematic. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take out our RGB SCART cable, plop in our composite cable, scroll down to composite, flick on the power, and as you can see, we're displaying in black and white. So, this is an issue, but let's also double check. So, let's also plop in S-Video. Trying to dig the cable out. All right, plugged in S-Video. Click on the power. And yeah, we got black and white over S-Video. Although you may not see it well in the camera, but it's appearing to me that the colors are a little flickery. So it looks like we have some issues related to the encoder circuit. So I have a feeling I know what's causing this. So without further delay, let's get this system open up and do some investigation work. And as always with these videos, it all starts with a system teardown. Okay, so now that we got the board broken down, we can now take a look and see what's causing our black and white video output. So it's going to be one of two components. It's either going to be the sRGB here, or more likely, it's going to be this little guy right here. This is a 20 picofarad variable capacitor, and it is attached in series to our master clock here. Now, it's not uncommon, especially with the GPM boards, for this trim cap to not only go out of spec, but also go bad. And when that happens, the subcarrier frequency also goes out of spec. And what happens from that is you end up with a composite and S-Video going black and white, but RGB will be perfectly fine. And the reason for that is RGB doesn't come out of the encoder, rather it's being split between the encoder circuit and the multi-out circuit. So with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to first try and adjust this trim cap here and see if we can restore color on composite and S-Video. And if that doesn't work, well, I have a whole donor board here and we can always just pull one out of it. So let's get back to ground level cam and see what we can do. Okay, so we have the system booted up again and on composite video. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our small flathead screwdriver here and see if we can adjust this. So I'm turning to the right. That's doing nothing. Let's turn to the left. That also does nothing. Like, I'm just turning. And it's not doing anything. So I think our trim cap here is just bad. So it looks like we're gonna have to pull one from our donor board here and plop it into the GPM board. So let's bust out the desoldering gun and get to it. Okay, so first order of business, since this is a through-hole part, we're going to reflow the pins underneath it and then hit it with our desoldering gun. So let's get to it. Okay, so before installing the replacement trim capacitor, there's something I want to note. You will notice here that the silk screen is keyed, and that's because the trim cap is polarized. So if we were to take a look at the donor board here, we can see that it has positive and negative markers. Now for the GPM board, which is what we're working on, it doesn't have those markers, but it's really easy to distinguish which side is which. So the flat side, as you can see here, is going to correlate with the flat side of our trim cap. But just to note, if you don't have like a flat side and a round side for the silk screen, just know that the rounded side is positive and the flat side is negative, you know, similar to a surface mount cap. So we're gonna go ahead, plop this on, and solder it in. Okay, so I have the system all plugged back up, and we're going to fire it up and see if that worked. So click on the switch, and unfortunately we still got black and white video. So it looks like our trim cap was not the culprit, but fortunately that means that we do have a spare trim cap just in case. But if it's not the trim cap, then it could be the master clock as well. Now, granted, you might be thinking like, well, you mentioned earlier how it could also be the encoder, and it really could be, but the fact that we're having like flickering color, it makes me wonder if it might not be the encoder itself that's bad, but rather we might have a faulty master clock. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap out the master clock crystal, and if that doesn't work, then we'll move on to the encoder. So without further delay, let's get to it. Okay, so I've gone ahead and changed out the master clock crystal off camera. I didn't feel the need to film it, mainly because it was basically the same process as getting the trim cap. But without further delay, we're just going to flick on the power and see if we got color now. And look at that, we got color over composite. So it looked like our issue the whole time was just a faulty crystal. But to double check, what we're gonna do is we're going to unplug composite, plug in S-Video, switch over to S-Video, flick on the switch, and it looks like we got color over S-Video as well. So that seems to be it, right? We got the system fixed up, so time to button it up and call it good. Well, we could do that, or we can recap it and upgrade it. And I think that's going to be much more interesting if you ask me. So let's get this system broken down even further and get to it. Okay, so I have the heatsink fully removed, so now we can get this board ready for a recap. But before we do that, there's something I want to address, and that is, this. This is the cartridge slot of our Super Nintendo here. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because, as you can see, this is a modular piece. And it's also a modular piece on the earlier SHVC motherboards. So, the reason why I want to talk about this is because I've seen other board revisions like the RGB, APU, which I have the donor board still here, and as well as the one chips, where the cartridge slot is either completely destroyed or completely mangled, or the traces underneath are completely sliced up, because people assume that all Super Nintendo cartridge slots are modular, but that's not the case. Starting from the RGB revision motherboards onward, they replaced the cartridge slot from a modular system to a traditional through-hole cartridge slot. So you can grip and twist this all you want. This is not going anywhere. If you have one of those board revisions, you need to desolder the cartridge slot if you actually need to get access to underneath it. It's not like the modular system here that you see with the GPM or even the SHVC, where you can just click that on and just pull it out. Just something to keep in mind if you plan on working these systems. Pay attention to your board revision. If it's a SHVC or a GPM revision, you're good to go. You can pull the cartridge slot off with just your fingers. If it's an RGB, APU, or even one chip system, please do not tamper with the cartridge slot unless you actually need to get access underneath it. And if you do need to get access, use a desoldering gun. So, with that little PSA out of the way, there is one other thing that we are going to be doing, and that's the stereo balance fix. Yeah, it doesn't just apply to the SHVC CPU 01, it also applies to the GPM motherboards as well as RGB 01. So, our point of focus is going to be this little guy right here, the D6376. So, unlike the SHVC module, this is going to be a much easier install because the trace that we need to cut is actually exposed between pins 9 and 10. So all we need to do in order to separate those two pins and install our own 47 microfarad capacitor for the other VREF signal is we could just take an X-Acto knife and just carefully cut between those two pins. That should separate them and allow us to add our extra cap. So without further delay, let's get to recapping this system as well as doing our stereo balance fix. So when it comes to recapping the GPM, the process is about the same as doing an SHVC motherboard, but there are a couple of key differences. Key difference number one is we don't have a sound module anymore. Instead, all the sound hardware is integrated onto the main motherboard. So we don't have to worry about that external piece or having to force open the metal gate. Secondly is we don't have the 100 microfarad capacitors anymore. Instead, they were all replaced with two 220 microfarad capacitors, one near the multi-out and one by the encoder. So the reason why I bring this up is in the event that you're going to be ordering a cap kit, pay attention to the motherboard that you're using. If you're going to be doing an SHVC CPU 01, you want to get one that is marked as SHVC. But for anything else, whether it's GPM, RGB, APU, or even the one chip revision, you want to get one that's marked as non-SHVC. That way you have the correct capacitors for your motherboard. I just want to bring this up because I've had that mistake before where I've accidentally mixed them up. Just pay close attention to the listings and you should be fine. So without further delay, let's get these caps removed. Okay, we got the board fully recapped. All that we need to do now is do the stereo balance fix. So let's zoom in on the D6376 here, and let me show you what we're going to be doing. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed in on D6376 here, and all we need to do to prepare the chip for a stereo balance fix is we need to cut the trace that links pins 9 and 10. Now, in the sound module, that requires that we remove the IC and then cut the trace underneath. Fortunately for the GPM and RGB01 boards, they located the trace literally between pins 9 and 10. So all we need to do is just come in with a craft knife and carefully cut between the legs. Now, you do have to be careful. There are other traces in close proximity, but as long as you're patient and go slowly, you should be fine. So let's try to do that right now. That should do it. So just to make sure, we're going to set our multimeter to continuity mode and see if we got a short. So I'm just going to put the multimeter by the microphone, and we're going to probe pins 9 and 10. We still got continuity, so we need to cut just a little deeper. I think that should do it now. And we no longer get continuity, so it looks like we have successfully cut the trace. But just to make sure that we didn't damage anything, let's probe pin 9 and hit the positive leg of this 47 microfarad capacitor. And it looks like that's still good. So we've isolated pin 10. Let me just take a closer look, just to make sure. And yeah, from a close visual inspection, it looks like that is cleanly cut with no damage to any of the traces behind it. So now that we got the trace cut, we need to locate a ground. And fortunately, that's not going to be too hard to find. This whole plane right here is ground. In fact, we have a little via here, and if we were to probe that and probe a ground plane, we get continuity. So we got a little ground via right here. So we don't have to attach it to another component in order to ground our capacitor. So all we need to do at this point is take our 47 microfarad 25 volt capacitor, Generally, you want to try to match it with the other one, but you know, you can go a little higher. Just gonna fold that down. Actually, am I within frame? There we go. So I've bent the legs of my capacitor. And we're just gonna trim just a little bit. We just need enough to where we can make contact with the pin. Okay. Now we're just gonna flux up this area here. And give it a nice 10. Just to make sure that there's nothing gonna be going into the solder that's a little bit cruddy. And here comes the tricky part, actually mounting the capacitor. Gonna apply a little flux here, a little flux here. Make sure the solder flows onto pin 10. And there we go. Let me take a closer look. Solder's a little weird. Okay. All right, so we got the capacitor installed onto pin 10 here. So all we need to do is expose just a little bit of ground plane here. We don't need a ton, just a little bit. Apply some flux. A little bit of solder. We're just going to come in and bend the leg down very carefully so it makes contact. Okay, it's going to make contact, so sorry for the kind of shoddy holding of the soldering iron. I am right-handed, so this is kind of an awkward position for me to be in. But I think that's linked up, and it has. And just to double check everything, this should now be ground. It is. This should link to pin 10. I'm not touching the leg. I am. And this should not be bridging pin 9. And it isn't. Oops. And it isn't. Okay. So we've verified that the capacitor is installed correctly, so our stereo balance is now applied. So that's really it in terms of the hardware preparation. Now we just need to move on to the next step, which is installing the edge enhancer. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed in here on the PPU2 as we need to do some prep work to it prior to installing the edge enhancer. So when it comes to installing the edge enhancer in a GPM motherboard, there are two methods of attack: the easy install and the advanced install. Now the easy install is, as the name suggests, it is an easier method for those with basic soldering skills and will absolutely get the job done. However, there is a chance that after the install, your system won't display as clear of a picture as it potentially can, and you may see jail bars as a result. This is not the fault of the kit, but rather the fault of all non-SHVC motherboards prior to the one chip. Unfortunately, whether it is GPM, RGB, or APU, these boards are very inconsistent in regards to video output. You may have a perfectly clean output after the install, you may end up with jail bars after the install. It's a total crapshoot with no way of predetermining the results. So for our purposes and ease of mind, we are going to do the advanced install, which starts with lifting pins 97, 96, and 95. Those are our blue, green, and red outputs respectively. From there, we will thread 3 30-AUG wires from the bottom of the PCB to the pins. So without further delay, let's lift some pins. Okay, so apologies for the shoddy camera work. It's really difficult to lift these pins while also trying to film, but as you can see, we were able to lift all 3 pins without breaking anything. So, now that we have our RGB lines lifted, we now need to thread some 30-AUG wire through the bottom of the board. And the way we're going to do that is I have here some pre-cut 30-AUG wire that I've been saving from like various handheld installs, and we're just going to thread it through some of these holes here. So let me show you how I do that. Okay, so we're focused on the bottom of the board here, and the reason why is we need to feed 3 wires through these 3 holes right here. Now, these are going to be your blue, green, and red lines respectively. Now, the green and red lines are not going to have any issues. The blue line, on the other hand, is directly underneath the PPU too. But that's okay. All we need to feed a wire through is we just need to have our 30-AUG conductor with a pretend and exposed lead. And we just need to push it through the hole. Let's flip it over. Make sure we can get it exposed. You can kind of see it right there. Oh, it's going between the ICs. We need it to go in between the 2 pins there. There we go. And all we gotta do is fish it out like a catfish during noodling season. So grab it from the tip. And pull it out. Nice and long. Like a little tapeworm. Alright, so we got our blue line in. Now we can solder that up. And we can do the same for the green and red lines. So let's get to it. Okay, so that was a bit of a pain in the ass to do, mainly because it's kind of hard to film while also soldering to these really tiny legs. But I also managed to flex the wires a bit, so it should clear the cartridge slot. And as you can see, it does. So with that being said, that's basically it for the PPU side of things. So now we can flip over the board and prep the rest of it for our edge enhancer. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed into this area, and the reason why is we need to remove a few components before installing our edge enhancer, much like the Ultimate Super Famicom we did before. So the components we need to remove are Q3, Q5, Q7, as well as R19, R18, R14, R13, R9, and R8, and as well as C8, C7, and C6. So let's bust out the hot air rework station and remove these SMD components. Okay, now that we got all those components removed and the wires installed, all we need to do now is take our quick solder board, plop it on, and get to soldering. Okay, so we got the interposer fully installed. Now you may notice that we have some jumpers here as well as some vias right here. These do not apply to the advanced install. These are only used for the basic install. So we don't need to worry about this area. All we need to do now is take our edge core and solder it in. Okay, now that we got the core board installed, all we need to do now is install the RGB wires. So we're going to install blue, green, and red. So let's fold over the wires, get them cut, and solder them on. Okay, so I did have to go off camera in order to fix a couple of things. I noticed that I accidentally bridged these two pins together. These should never be bridged, but I also had to cut the wires just a little bit shorter because they were a little longer than I wanted them to be, but as you can see, we got a nice clean install here. So all that's left is to install the multi-out board and do the RGB mixer stuff, and we should be good to go. Objection! Sorry for the interruption, but it seems that I accidentally skipped a step. So when installing the edge enhancer in a non-SHVC motherboard, you need to pay attention to what revision of PPU2 you are working with. So the instructions state that we need to remove these 3 components from the interposer for systems that don't have a PPU2C revision. Since I am working with a PPU2B revision, I have gone ahead and removed them from the interposer. So with that out of the way, let's continue on. So let's get to it. Okay, so we're back over to this area because we're going to be installing the 3 lines for our RGB mixing circuit. Now, the 3 lines need to be installed on the rightmost pads of C8, C7, and C6. Now, last time I used a bit of ribbon cable for that, but this time I'm going to do something a little different. What I have here is some extra lengths of wire from various other projects. Now, these are all 26-AUG silicone wire, which is plenty serviceable for what we're going to be using it for. So, we're going to get these wires cut up, installed onto the interposer here, and reinstalled back into the board. So let's get to it. Okay, now that we got the RGB mixing circuit installed, all we need to do now is install the multi-out PCB and install our flat flex cables. So without further delay, let's get to it. Okay, last steps here. I just need to clean up the board and then we can install the flat flex cable and then we can move on to testing. So without further delay, let's get to it. Oh, and don't think for a second that I didn't notice the fuse. I did notice the solder joints on this fuse were a little bit crusty, so I did do some reflow work on that. But in any case, this board is now cleaned up, so we can now install the flat flex cable and move on to testing. Okay, so we got the Flatflex cable installed. So with that, the Edge Enhancer install is complete for this little GPM board. So all that's left to do is to get it all hooked up and tested to make sure everything's still working. So let's get to it. Okay, we are now back to the hand cam for now because we got everything kind of dry fitted together. We got the controller board, the power switch, the AC adapter, as well as our video cable. So we're gonna fire this up and make sure it still works. So I have composite currently plugged in, so flick that on, and look at that, we still got composite. So far the mixing circuit looks good, but let's unplug that. Switch to S-Video. Flick on for S-Video. And we still got S-Video. Oops. Plug that. Plug in RGB SCART. And we still got RGB SCART. So it looks like the hardware is working and our mod is looking beautiful. So now that we've confirmed that the mod works, we can now move on to the final stages, which is reassembling the system. So let's get to it. Okay, so we have the system all fully reassembled and fully hooked up and ready for testing. Now, you may have noticed that I had to completely reassemble the top shell here, and also I had some blue gloves within my normal gloves earlier in the video, Well, that's mainly because I had to run this top shell through my RetroBrite box because it was just a bit yellowed. And as you can see, I think it turned out rather well. So with that out of the way, let's fire up the system, run the burn-in test, and make sure it's still good. All right, everything looks good. Now, I'm not going to be able to show any before and after footage of this running. I'm sorry. I forgot to capture footage of the board prior to installing the Edge Enhancer, and unfortunately, I don't have another GPM motherboard to test with. But rest assured, this looks vastly superior compared to a stock GPM. Like, it's not even close. Okay, editing Fenris here with a quick interjection. Shortly after I was done filming this video, I actually was able to get my hands on a GPM Revision Super Famicom that happens to have the same hardware configuration as the SNES we modded. So, there actually will be a hardware comparison between stock and modded towards the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the rest of the testing. So next up, Mode 7. All right, Mode 7 looks good. Next up, CIC. All right, looks like we're able to get into the game. Next up, expansion pin games. And yes, this system is modified to also be able to put in Super Famicom games. If you want to see how I go about doing that with Super Nintendos, I'd recommend checking out my Ultimate Super Nintendo video. But for now, let's just fire this up and make sure it works. Yeah, it looks pretty good to me. And last but certainly not least, Kamen Rider. Looks good to me. So yeah, with that, the system is fully working and ready for gaming. Now, I would like to take the time to thank Voltar for helping me go over some of my wording in this video to make sure I'm not misrepresenting anything. Now, he has been incredibly patient with me, and I can't thank him enough for that. Yeah, so with that, we're basically done here. If you liked what you saw, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And also, happy holidays from the Tech Cave. Hope you're all making the most of your holiday season and having a good time while doing it. And yeah, as always, viewers, till the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.